me in the microphone.
Oui, excusez-moi, je viens de vous envoyer un nouveau diapo, nouvelle présentation parce qu'il y avait un bug sur celui-là. Donc est-ce que vous pouvez le changer, s'il vous plaît? Merci. Good afternoon. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. We've got a fascinating afternoon ahead of us. So my name is John Seaman. I am a research fellow with the French Institute of International Relations. But I am not talking to you today in my IFRI hat from Paris, but rather as a representative of the European Think Tank Network on China, or ETNC, which is the reason why you're all gathered here today to discuss what is the 10th anniversary report that we have put out last June, and we're very excited to present it to you here today about a topic that is on everybody's mind, talk about strategic autonomy in the context of the US-China rivalry. So as I said, this is the 10th anniversary report of the European Think Tank Network of China. What is ETNC? We actually got together 11 years ago here in Brussels, 11 institutes from 11 different European countries with the idea in a very different era in EU-China relations. It was a different time. It was, in fact, a very different era. And we noticed that there was actually very little conversation going on amongst us Europeans, China experts, but amongst Europeans in general, about the local contexts of our relations with China. There was a lot of conversation going on about EU level, grand design, bilateral relations between the EU and China. There was some discussion about major country relations with China, France, China, Germany, China, but there was very little granularity about what was actually going on in Spain, in Romania, in the Netherlands, and in these various bilateral relationships, and how that multiplicity of bilateral relationships ultimately helped shape and define what would become the EU's approach to China. So we hear time and time again how the EU often takes initiatives or tries to put forward ideas and grand designs and come up with plans, but has trouble putting them in motion sometimes. No critique. But oftentimes what is holding the EU back is this diversity from the member states, is resistance from the member states, a lack of consensus. And we noticed this was happening on China. This was already 10 years ago. And so we sat down here in Brussels and we tried to think about what is it that is defining Europe's relations with China? Where do we converge? Where do we diverge? Where's the consensus? And from that process, we all got along swimmingly with a great group of folks, and you'll hear from a number of them today, sitting next to me, sitting across from me. And so really for the last 11 years, we sit down once every 6 months and we compare notes on our various bilateral relationships with China. We decide what would be interesting to inform the public about, what sort of analysis would be interesting to inform the European debate with our own member state perspectives. And we do this in an independent way. We do this in a self-financed way, which in some ways is a big sacrifice for some of us. But that leads to independent analysis, and that leads to objective analysis, and we think that that has a very important role in informing the European policy debate. So we started with 11 member states, or 11 countries, not even, well, there were member states at the time. The UK was still part of the EU back then. That was before Brexit. And now we're at 23 European countries, 23 institutes in 23 different European countries. And we put out an annual report. I can't go back for some reason. Go forward and then go back. Sorry, now it goes. No, it doesn't go. There we go. We got it. There is one missing on COVID. That was a special report that I had the great pleasure of doing in my living room, and everybody else is in their living room. But we've been following the evolution of Europe's relations with China really over the last 10 years. And 10 years ago, it was rather striking to see the narrative, if we go back to our original reports. And I think we spent quite a bit of time discussing this, about how at the time we were presenting very clearly in a number of capitals, China as an opportunity. This was a post-global financial crisis. A lot of European economies were struggling, and European member states were tripping over each other to present what we would call 27 gateways to Europe. And we were all looking to attract Chinese investment into Europe. We were looking for best ways to open China's market. Some of the themes are similar today, but the context has evolved considerably. So over the course of the time, we've looked at China's emergence as a global actor, its grand designs, its plans, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, and how we all interact with that. The shift in, I would say, the nature of Chinese economy and our economic relationship with China from 2015 and the Made in China 2025 strategy, which really ushered in an era of change where we used to have economic complementarity with China, and now very clearly we've moved into an era of competition. We looked in various reports about these ideas of political values and how that informs our relations and member state relations, but also in relations at the EU level with China, and how that infuses this notion of systemic rivalry. So we were already discussing these themes that would become part of the tripartite or triptych approach to China within our reports. And of course, we've more recently dealt with issues of dependence and de-risking, again, from a member state perspective. And the report that we're going to discuss today, I think, is a very timely one, but one that we already touched on 5 years ago. And Mario will tell us about it. This was at a time, and I remember we were hosted in part by the Egmont Institute and Egmont's Sven Biskop, I'm sorry, it was lapse. In 2020, I remember having a conversation with Sven Biskop, who essentially said, we've reached an era where what is good for the United States is no longer good for Europe. We used to have a clear convergence with the United States, but no longer. And that is changing not only our relationship with the United States, but with China as well, and the way that we see China, the types of opportunities that China presents. That was 5 years ago. And so we covered that and that dynamic in one of our reports. And now we've decided it's a ripe time to come back. We present China as here in Europe, and this is my own self-speaking, this is not reflected in the report, but we present China as a systemic rival. In some ways, I think maybe we need to start thinking about whether or not we need to apply that label to the United States as well. And that notion, maybe we might not vocalize it, but the sense that we are questioning our relationship with the United States is giving rise to this debate on strategic autonomy. So we decided to pursue this analysis head on to see how 20 plus member states, 22, I think, 22 European countries treat this question of US-China rivalry. What is driving the dynamics and how do we define this notion of strategic autonomy within that context? So I will let, obviously, Mario have his moment to explain how he went about this study, the conclusions that come from our analysis. But before we do that, I think it's very opportunistic or opportune to present the Deputy Director General at DG Trade, Maria Martin Pratt, who has had a very long career of negotiations, particularly with China, very key negotiations, and you have very key insider insight into the relationship with China. So before we shift into the conclusions of the report, I think it's important that we get a sense from you about your view of this question of strategic autonomy and how Europe is approaching this US-China rivalry. So without further ado, I'll give you the floor for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes max, let's say. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll try to do it in 15 minutes. And let me first congratulate you for the 10th year anniversary of the European Think Tank Network on China, and for the very good work that you have been producing over the years. This latest report, 268 pages, is a gigantic effort, but one that as far as the parts I have read, and I have read a few, I think is of a very good and important value. It's certainly the most comprehensive overview of how the US-China rivalry affects the EU that I have come across. And it comes at a very important time. As you indicate yourself in the introduction to the report, the EU is not an equidistant player between China and the US. Our ties with the US from an economic, a security, and a societal point of view remain closer. We might be going through difficult times, but I think that cannot be forgotten. But it's also correct to say that the relations between the EU and the US, the EU and China, and equally crucially, the US and China are evolving, and that an unprecedented amount of uncertainty remains as to the future developments of those relations. If you look at the events that have happened simply between the publication of the report in June and now, there are a number of them that are very relevant and important. We had the EU-China 25th summit, 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations that took place on the 24th of July in Beijing. The EU and the US reached a political agreement on trade that was finalized on the 27th of July and is reflected in the joint statement that was published on the 21st of August. And the US and China continue to negotiate. The latest round of contacts in Madrid seems to have resulted in a framework deal on TikTok. We need to see the details. But basically a deal to avoid the ban of the app in the United States. There are talks about a possible call between leaders on Friday. There is a truce on tariffs that has been extended to November, and we have heard noises as to that extension maybe being prolonged. And everybody is wondering whether the US and China will make a trade deal. So it's very clear these three bilateral relations are undeniably linked. Sometimes we refer to it as a triangle. Unfortunately, it's not an equilateral triangle for those of you that remember your geometry. But what is very clear that to be able to shape this triangle to its own advantage, the EU must advance in the quest for strategic autonomy. And that is something that your report alludes to. Now, zooming back into the report, I paid particular attention to the second paper, the paper that deals with the EU's approach to the US-China rivalry. And that paper is somewhat provocatively titled, Increased US Hostility Opens Window for Warmer EU-China Relations. Now let's check whether the title holds in view of the latest developments. If I start with the US, the US-EU relationships are under stress, but it's also very clear that the US continues to be our main economic relationship. We have a transatlantic economic relationship that is worth 1.7 trillion euros of trade every year. Confronted with what is an exceptional situation because of the United States imposing tariffs on imports from trading partners around the world, including the European Union, our overriding priority has been to stabilize the situation and to create, to the extent possible, clear and predictable conditions for the transatlantic trade and supply chains. And I put an emphasis on to the extent possible. That is what is behind the EU and the US joint statement that was issued on the 21st of August. And that is the framework that will continue to guide our actions. We have, at this point, avoid a harmful tariff escalation across the Atlantic. We need to continue working to increase stability. We are perfectly aware of the fact that it's not going to be a smooth ride, smooth sailing. We are in a very tense geopolitical environment, and we continue to see developments that are unsettling. The latest examples are, for instance, the discussions on secondary sanctions in the forms of tariffs on China and India for the support to the Russian economy. This has come up in the last few days as declarations from President Trump. And we also see, for instance, the continuation of tensions regarding the European regulatory measures involving or affecting US tech companies. So in sum, we have achieved a relatively measure of stability with the US. We are investing to further improve the relationship despite the uncertainty of the present times. So let me move to China. And the paper asks the question of whether the tension in the transatlantic relation opens the door for rapprochement between the EU and China. Let me give you very quickly first a more general state of play of the EU-China trade relation before I give you my view as to whether there is such a rapprochement. And where are we in terms of our trade relation with China? I think President von der Leyen found the right words in the context of the summit in July when she said that the EU-China trade relationship is at an inflection point. On the one hand, we have a trade relation that is robust and investment ties that are deep. We have China being the second economy in the world and our third largest trading partner, and also a source of very critical resources that we need for our economy. On the other hand, China is an increasingly challenging trading partner, and our trade relationship remains critically unbalanced. And I think you are all familiar with the numbers that underpin this reality in terms of the deficit in trade, the growth of exports volumes to the EU, and basically the weight that the Chinese economy has in global manufacturing production with all the problems that this creates in terms in particular of overcapacities. We do have at the moment a situation in which we can see the use of export markets such as the EU, but also many other third countries as outlet for excess production at low prices. And this also is being exacerbated by the restrictions into the US market. So the situation in terms of the effects, the negative effects of the Chinese industrial policy are being felt very, very acutely. Drivers for this situation are well known in terms of the distortive economic policies that China has, and also in terms of the barriers and discriminations to not only the entry into the Chinese market, but also the functioning, the possibility for our investors to function on the basis of a level playing field once they are in China. So these are issues, these are frictions that have been part of our relationship for a long time and that are not being addressed. And they are accumulating and getting to a position where the European Union is accumulating as well frustration in terms of how to navigate and handle this relationship. And what is also becoming very evident at the moment is the readiness of China to use trade dependencies as a weapon. And this is happening not only vis-a-vis the European Union, it is probably the biggest card in the negotiations with the United States. The very obvious case, at least the most recent one, is the enlargement of the system of export controls in a manner that we consider unjustified, and that is being used in a retaliatory manner in a number of cases. The same as China is using trade defense as retaliation. And I'll get back to this in a minute. So that is why, as your report indicates as well, we are going from an attempt to engage with China, although that engagement continues, to a clear attempt to take autonomous action because of the lack of results in the bilateral engagement with a view to rebalance and de-risk our relations with China. We have steadily developed a toolbox of autonomous instruments on top of what you could call more traditional trade defense instruments that aim in some cases, for instance, public procurement to get reciprocity in some other cases, like the foreign subsidy regulation, to try to ensure that Chinese subsidies don't distort the internal market when we are confronted to cases of investment or public procurement. And we are also implementing resilience criteria, for instance, in internal market legislation. You can think about the Net Zero Industry Act that does include that type of criteria to diversify the union's imports in cases of critical dependencies on a single country. But again, and this is a very clear development, what we observe is that every time we deploy these autonomous tools and implement what we consider to be legitimate fact-based and very carefully prepare EU measures, China meets us with unfounded tit-for-tat retaliation. And this is creating a escalatory dynamic that is blocking progress at the moment in our relations. We saw that with the battery energy vehicles tariffs that triggered then the start of 3 cases, 2 on grounds of dumping and 1 on grounds of subsidy or alleged grounds covering the sectors of brandy, dairy, and pork. So I think this about sums where the EU-China trade relations are. We are at an inflection point where the EU needs to resort to autonomous action. There where the bilateral engagement does not produce result, and where we are going to have to be ready to react when China retaliates. You have therefore probably realized by now that my assessment of the rapprochement or the possibility of rapprochement that was floated in the paper is rather negative. And when you hear that some expected some sort of a charm offensive by China after the US announcement of the so-called Liberation Day tariffs, we haven't seen that charm offensive. It's rather been worsening of our relations, of our bilateral relations with China, whether it's been because of the export controls or the retaliatory cases I was referring to, or for other reasons. And one that continues to be very present, and this is not trade related, but is even more important than trade, is that the Europeans cannot forget the Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine and the continuation of that war being also supported by the supply of dual-use materials to Russia. That is an element of increasing importance in our assessment of our relations with China. So rapprochement is not happening, but we will always be ready to try to engage constructively with China, while at the same time we are very much aware of the fact that we need to focus on de-risking, rebalancing the relationship through autonomous tool, and diversifying our trade relation globally. And very quickly then on diversification. So that is a point that is also contained in your report. Is indeed a very important priority in our current trade policy. And is in particular important to the quest for strategic autonomy that you mentioned. Basically, the EU strategic autonomy requires us to think beyond the triangular relationship between the US, China, and the EU. We need to continue engaging with the rest of the world. We need to strengthen our links with the rest of the world. And that is an area where the Commission has been extremely active in the last years. You know that we've just put on the table the proposals to ratify Mercosur and Mexico. We're about to conclude negotiations of a free trade agreement with a country of the size as important as Indonesia. We're in very active negotiations with India, where there is a political target to conclude before the end of the year. And there are also very active negotiations with other countries in Southeast Asia. And you have probably also heard about announcements of a structural engagement with groups of countries such as the CPTPP. So there is a momentum in a number of these negotiations, and this is part of what we consider needs to be an overall strategy. Beyond diversification, we do need to prepare to have real strategic autonomy. We're never going to be totally diversified from the big economies in the world. We're talking about China, we can talk about the US. We need to be realistic as to how much we can diversify certain dependencies. In the case of China, for instance, when you think about critical raw materials or some types of technologies. This is where the concept of deterrence plays a role. Indeed, a dependency on China or on any other country, a dependency even in an important supply chain, may be seen as something we can live with insofar as we are capable from deterring the country we are dependent from weaponization that dependency. So having a deterrent strategy is part and parcel of our economic security strategy. And that is an area where the Commission is now concentrating and putting a lot of efforts. We need third countries to internalize in their decision making that the EU is capable of effectively deploying leverage to protect its interest. And for that, it is essential that we have the right tools to do this. That is something that you will see reflected in the upcoming economic security doctrine that we will be presented before the end of the year. So that's where we are. I think in the context of the EU-China-US triangle that I've been talking about, the EU needs to have a strategic autonomy that allows it to not be depending on any of the other two sides of that triangle, or at least to manage to the extent possible those dependencies. I need to recognize that there are some elements that we cannot control. And as I was saying at the beginning of my intervention, we are going to follow with interest the developments in the US relationship with China. But I think I'll stop here. I'm happy to engage in the discussion going forward.
Excellent, thank you. We'll get into a discussion portion of this event here after we hear from Mario. But I would be very interested to hear more about this deterrence notion, particularly as strategic autonomy is not a question of autarky, and there is necessarily a balance of dependencies and interdependencies, and how you play on those and how you augment your strategic leverage as a deterrent to coercive action is definitely something that I'd be interested in discussing a bit more. But you've commented on the EU chapter of the report, and so thank you very much for your feedback and bringing us up to date since publication of June, and to take us into the meat of the report and some of the conclusions, particularly of the country level chapters in our bottom-up approach that we take in ETNC. I'll pass it over to Mario Esteban, who was our lead editor of this report. Every year we have a different lead editor, and it's a very arduous task to herd cats through 20 chapters. But you did a fantastic job, and thank you very much for those efforts. And please give us a sense of what we should take away from the report. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you so much to all of you for being here today and taking the time of hearing, our thoughts on this very relevant topic. As you could see before, and we presented all the topics, for the reports along these years, this is the first time in a decade that we have decided to revisit a topic. This is not only for the relevance of the issue at hand itself, but also because in the last few years, very significant things happened, and the strategic landscape shift very dramatically, for things like the COVID-19, Russia's war and aggression against Ukraine, the arrival of a very disruptive, second Trump administration. So to some extent, we were like forced, to revisit this topic. In this report, first we have, like an introduction that can be read to some extent as an executive summary of the whole of the report. And then we have 23 chapters. 21 are devoted to different EU member states. Another one is devoted to the UK. And last one was devoted to the European Union. And on all those chapters, we focus on three different things. First, we look at how those European actors how the relationship between those European actors and the US and China has evolved in the last 5 years. Then we look at how those actors have dealt with this US-China rivalry, in the last 5 years. And finally, we try to present how we do things that those actors are going to deal with this issue, in the foreseeable future. We can argue that the main conclusion of the report, is that this new geopolitical context that Maria, elaborated a lot, during her presentation, has increased, increased the support inside of Europe for this concept of strategic autonomy. Okay. In most of the survey countries, there are 2 exceptions, which are Italy and Hungary, but in all the other, most of the other actors, the support has increased. At the core of this discussion, is the recognition that Europe must reduce its dependency, on external powers, particularly in those big powers, in key areas such as security, the economy, and technology. But this actual situation is much more nuanced, and the devil is in the details, and now I will try to elaborate a little bit more on those details. Okay. First, we look at the security and defense field, security and defense cooperation. It's very obvious that European defense cooperation with the US has remained strong and has intensified among the countries covered in the report, for the last 5 years. And it was reinforced to a very big extent to a heightened perception of the US relevance for European security in the context of the war in Ukraine, that was mentioned before. However, the return of Donald Trump to the White House, has also cast a shadow, over this momentum, because his erratic and aggressive behavior sometimes, and things related with Greenland, things related, to his position toward the role of Russia, in the conflict in Ukraine, and this has created concern, in Europe. I think it's very obvious, and he has created bigger doubts, on the reliance of the US as a defense and a security partner. And it has triggered, or he has contributed to the advance of EU-level initiatives, on defense and security. I think this is very clear, in the different chapters of the report. By contrast, security and defense cooperation between European actors and China remains virtually non-existent. Not only the EU embargo on weapons embargo on China is still in place, but recent development has also brought forward debates on restricting transfer of dual-use technology and things like, particularly the role of China, to some extent a significant enabler or facilitator, Russian aggression against Ukraine, has also changed, have deteriorated more, the image of China, as a security partner, in some areas, and also China's participation, or the participation of Chinese actors, in hybrid threats, things related with cyber attacks, things related like disinformation, has also increased the feeling in some European actors that China is not only mainly a partner for defense and security, but even, a competitor, or a threat at some levels, So the view, in different EU actors, towards cooperation with China on this security and defense area is very different, to the perceptions on the US. And by the way, it was quite obvious that the developments this summer, with Xi Jinping cozying up, with Putin and Kim Jong-un probably doesn't contribute much to this, although of course this is not covered in the report. When it comes to economic relations, for example, we focus on trade, with trade, and in our 2020 report, we noted that the only area in which the EU's economic links with China were significantly stronger than with the US was in goods imports. And this is basically this trend largely continues today. Overall, the share of goods trades between the EU and the US has remained fairly stable over the past 5 years, with EU exports to the US falling by 5% and import from the US showing no significant change. We are talking, till December 2024, because in order for comparison, among all these actors, we have to use figures up to last year. By contrast, trade imbalances with China has widened in nearly all survey countries. France is the only exception. If we look, for example, EU exports to China between 2018 and 2023, those EU exports to China have dropped by 19%, while imports from China rose by 3%. Obviously, the trade imbalance by China, trade deficit by China has increased also because of that, and it's very obvious that China has lost weight as a market for the EU. Trade deficit, 2019, 164 billion, and in the last 2 years, roughly 300 billion, 2023, 2024. This is very obvious. And when we look also for bilateral, specific cases, in the case of Germany, which is the EU's largest trading power, the shift have been also quite striking. And in 2022, the US overtook China as Germany's largest trading partner for the first time in nearly a decade. When we look at investment, the situation is very different. In terms of FDI, the US clearly remains the EU's dominant partner across all survey countries. By 2024, US accounted for almost 17% of total FDI stock in the EU and absorbed 15.5% of the EU's outward FDI. So it was also the top destination for EU outward FDI. China's role in comparison is far more limited. Among the countries surveyed in the report, Hungary registered the highest share of Chinese inward investment at only 5%. I say only compared, with the figures I was giving before, to the US. And on the outward side, Germany stands out with 6% of its total FDI stock directed toward China. And in addition, survey countries report significantly greater security concerns around Chinese investment, both inbound and outbound, particularly inbound, than around investment flows involving the US. And this leads us to other of the topics, covered in the report, which is the European economic security agenda. And of course, the role that the US and China plays in the development of that agenda. It's also very obvious that China has played a significant role from the very beginning, the conception of this agenda. But it's also obvious that the US, is having is also being an actor, being concerned lately, because of this directive dimension of the Trump administration that I mentioned before. But this is not really covered much on the report because of the time frame, of the report. But what we found on this area is that some elements of this economic security agenda, such as the 5G, have already led to tighter regulation and greater oversight. But overall, Europe's economic security strategy remains, of course, incomplete, and public debate on key aspects is still limited, and major gaps persist in both understanding the challenges and developing effective policy tools. And there are very significant changes among the different countries within the report, how to position themselves on those issues. France has emerged as a leader in advancing this de-risking agenda and broader economic security initiative. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have, of course, Orban in Hungary, or we have also, Fico government in Slovakia, who are less concerned about this. More specifically, in this report, we cover in particular detail the developments regarding the outward foreign direct investment, this discussion, and also the discussion about dual-use export controls. And we have very detailed, relatively detailed, data, on the surveys and the survey countries in the report, for these two topics. Overall, despite growing support for de-risking, most European countries continue to acknowledge the strategic importance of access to Chinese market and to Chinese supply chains, and remain hesitant to transfer too much authority to Brussels on these issues. Other topic, that we cover in the report is how these different European actors engage with Chinese diplomatic initiatives. And yes, I'm going to put on the table only one example, which is the BRI. It's very obvious, how, it's very obvious how European attitudes on the BRI have shifted in the last 5 years. We elaborate really a lot on this in the report, but I will give you just some data, some very obvious example. In 2019, when the second Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation, was celebrated in Beijing, of the 18 countries that we celebrate in the 2020 report, out of 18 countries, 14 were represented by the head of state, head of government, or minister. Okay, I repeat, 14 out of 18. In 2023, only Greece and Hungary sent high-level delegations, and even Greece reduced the level of the delegation because, in 2019 was represented by the prime minister, and in 2023 was only ministerial level. So this is a very obvious example, how this appeal has been reduced and growing securitization of relationship with China. And this is also one of the things that we can see on the report, I think, very obviously. And finally, this data, the key issue of strategic autonomy. Okay. Well, I'm going to save you all the difference in the specific meaning, different countries, different positions. I will just get to very key takeaways. I think that the most obvious thing, as I mentioned before, is that support for strategic autonomy has grown in many of the countries surveyed. Even if, as I said, this trend should be interpreted with caution, we can see different sub-regional situations. For example, in Southern and Western Europe, support is relatively stronger and consistent, and many of the countries in that part of Europe remain fairly committed or more committed to advancing the agenda. The UK and Ireland, they adopt a more cautious position, shaped by traditionally Atlanticist orientation, in those both countries. And when we go to Nordic and Baltic states, there is a modest increase in support, driven by shifting regional security concerns. And when we come to Central and Eastern Europe, ambivalence dominates, with most positions remaining relatively unchanged. So in that part of Europe, the changes are not that significant. And just remember what I said before, that we even have two countries, Italy, and Hungary, that have reduced the support for this strategic autonomy agenda, because obviously both Meloni and Orban, they want, to cultivate relations, at the personal level with Donald Trump. So, and I'm just finishing, I have 1 more minute. Yes, the conclusion, overall, the trend points to growing distrust toward the United States, a cautious and selective re-engagement with China, and an increasing willingness to pursue strategic autonomy. Yet, putting these principles into practice remains difficult. The struggle to develop a coherent economic security agenda highlights the broader challenge of turning ambition into concrete policy. Looking ahead, European countries will continue to balance a complex set of factors, managing ties with China, responding to the expectation of the transatlantic alliance, and advancing their own national foreign policy agendas. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Mario. Thank you also to Maria for these introductory remarks, this analysis. And now let's dig into the discussion. And I will hand the floor over to Miguel Otero. And then we will finish up with conclusions from Bernard Bartsch. Thank you also for joining us. Miguel, go ahead.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for all of those that made it all the way. And we have now, I think, an excellent panel to discuss both the report, Maria's comments, and the events that have happened since the report has been produced. And I'm going to go following the order of the program. We have Elena Suarez, who is Senior Advisor for China, the Business Europe. Then we have Andrea Brinza, who is the Vice President of the Romanian Institute for the Study of the Asia Pacific. Unfortunately, Ignacio Garcia Bercero, he was on his way from Delhi and he missed his connection. so he cannot join us, but we have Xiaoshui Martin from the Klingendal China Center, research fellow there and part of the ETNC network. And finally, Finbar Birmingham, who is the Brussels correspondent of the South China Morning Post, that has, I think, a unique as well perspective on this uneven or not perfect triangle. I would say 5, max 7 minutes each for a first round. We'll try to be strict. So given that you see me in front of you, I will maybe even put a tag on, or I will show you that the time is up so that we make it more dynamic, and maybe have a second round. And then we obviously will open it up. Maria is still with us, so we can open it up for questions from the audience. So Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here today. And let me start by again congratulating the consortium of think tanks on the launch of this report. And recently, I was speaking with someone about the importance of having solid expertise on China in Europe, and I think that we have been trying to build this over the last years, and I think that your consortium it's a proof of that. So congratulations on the report as well. It's a long report. I read some of the chapters of certain member states, and of course the introduction and so on. So it really captures the huge challenges and complexity of the current geopolitical moment we are living in. This has been already mentioned, the intensifying US-China rivalry, the US becoming more hostile and China more assertive, the wars we have ongoing in Russia, in the situation in Gaza. And these are all issues that have a direct impact on European industry, and my intervention today will be from that perspective. So let me say that the analysis is very good, is spot on what's going on, and I think that many of us share that analysis without a doubt. So I would say that one highlight for me on the findings of the report is that while there is now a growing consensus in Europe on the need for strategic autonomy, member states are moving at different speeds, often with uneven ambition. And from a business perspective, this lack of alignment creates fragmentation, uncertainty for companies, different legislations they have to comply with, etc. So that is why, from an industry perspective, we push for greater consistency and coordination at European level. So that is why we consider that the efforts from the Commission to really push member states in one direction are very positive. Some examples are the foreign direct investment screening mechanism, and now it has been recently reviewed, or the 5G cybersecurity toolbox. We are now working on an economic security strategy and an economic security doctrine, which it will probably be quite bureaucratic, but I think it's important to have this framework to steer member states in a certain direction so that, you know, we create awareness and we all move in the same direction. And then also, when it comes to unity, more fundamentalist that, and we have said this from the business community several times, is that only a strong and united Europe can really master the economic and political leverage that we need to effectively engage, but also compete with China and with the US. I already said that the analysis is spot on, but of course it's more of a description of what's going on at the moment. What do we have there, member states? But now we need to think, okay, how do we move on? How do we take it from here? I would contribute with 3 main words, and I will add one thanks to Maria as well, and the discussion that we had before. And this is competitiveness, diversification, de-risking, but also building leverage. So when it comes to competitiveness, I think that now there is a strong consensus that we absolutely need to improve the Draghi report. I think it's a great analysis and says it all. I don't need to now elaborate a lot on that front. Precisely yesterday, there was a high-level dialogue where he participated and took a stock on our progress on implementing his report. So here I think that, again, the analysis, we all share it. It's more about the speed to put into, to really implement these suggestions. When it comes to diversification, I fully agree with what Maria has said. And really, we have been pushing for this for a long time, the need to diversify and move beyond over-reliance on the US and China. There are plenty of countries out there, and we need to diversify not only economically, so that we don't have dependencies on sourcing certain inputs from one country only or selling our goods to another country only, but that really we diversify. I think that there is momentum indeed on this front. Maria already mentioned certain FTAs, Mercosur, Indonesia, recently concluded, India ongoing. I think that today, precisely, there is a communication that has been published on India. But there are also other types of partnerships, like the CTIPs or critical raw materials partnerships. And of course, also the Global Gateway is, I think, an instrument that we can very much use in our diversification efforts with many countries. Africa has not been mentioned, but I think it's also a continent with a huge potential. Then when it comes to de-risking, well, companies are already responding. They are, trying their best to diversify supply chains, investing in alternative sources for their inputs. And indeed, I mean, the latest export controls of raw materials, particularly magnets from China, it's a warning sign for companies. I mean, we knew it for many years that this could have come at one point because of the massive leverage that the Chinese have, but now it has happened. That companies find themselves that they cannot find these fundamental materials for their production. And the risking is also about, well, a point I want to make is that it's about reducing our dependencies to a point that they cannot be used as leverage or being weaponized by China. For example, if China controls now 90% of raw materials, specific raw materials, but we can partner with Australia or others to reduce that dependency. This is also another strategy of de-risking. A final word when it comes to China. Of course, China is a key geopolitical and economic player, no doubt. We need to continue to find ways to engage with China, even if dialogue is not easy. That's the first point I would like to make. Of course, if companies can continue to benefit from doing business in China or sourcing inputs from China, they are welcome to do so, but of course they should be prepared for, being squeezed out of the market, find themselves that, they are confronted with export controls or restrictions, etc. The second point is that our strategy towards China should be independent and not be based on what is dictated by others. And recently, we have seen that, of course, coming from the US. And a final word that I would say is that there might be still opportunities to cooperate with China. The obvious one is climate change, but perhaps also in other areas like WTO or standardizations as well. It's a huge actor, and we need to also count on China for global challenges. I'd leave it here. Thanks.
Thanks, Rena. So yeah, I mean, some key words there: competitiveness that came up before as well, diversification, de-risking, pulling leverage, and I guess a lot of this could be perhaps summarized in indispensability, right? To be indispensable in this world, I guess that would be not only for the European Union's point of view, but at all levels, right? At the member state level, at the company level, at the product level. I mean, that would be, I think, one way as well. I remember when we did some work on how the Spanish business community sees strategic autonomy, that, how do you define to be strategically autonomous or have more economic security? That word came out, right? To be, once you're indispensable, then you have much more leverage, obviously. Andrea, please, the turn is yours. The voice from the ETNC network.
Thank you so much, Miguel. So I want to talk about the competition between China and the United States from the point of view of Central and Eastern Europe, because I think we should remember that the region some years ago was wrongly accused of being the weak link of the European Union. So it was labeled as a Trojan horse inside the European Union. The discussion is very broad, and I don't want to dive in right now, but basically the Central and Eastern European countries' relations with China were focused only on economic interests. So they have this pragmatic economic perspective regarding the relations with China, and they weren't perceived adopting their ideology or values. Why start with this idea? Because coming to present times, the region decision between the United States and China was quite simple. The Central and Eastern European countries stand by the United States. They are staunch allies of the United States, mainly because let's say, security guarantees. As you could see, the proximity with Russia determined the region being very close to the United States. And what I want to say is that this approach regarding the position of the Central and Eastern Europe to China didn't come out of nowhere. It started back in 2017 when we have the first Trump administration, and because back then the region was fearing Russia and a possible Russian invasion and so on, they decided to make a lot of compromises and interact a lot with the Trump administration and implement a lot of their proposal. So there was the moment when the 5G ban on Huawei came as let's say strategy in the region, Romania being the first country to sign such a MOU, then was followed by Poland. Then we have the adherence to the clean network, which was also as a way to promote and to make the United States stay in the region and offer us security guarantees. Basically, this was the main idea. Also, in the same time, we have this problem regarding the wave of disappointment that the Central and Eastern Europe was passing through because China. So back in 2013, we had this 16+1 summit, which actually was in Bucharest, where a lot of MOUs and projects were signed between China and many Central and Eastern European countries. Many of those MOUs and projects were canceled, abandoned, and so on. The only important project that is still today, but it took 10 years to be implemented and we are still counting, is the Budapest-Belgrade Railway. So it was signed back then in 2013. So we have the Russian factor, we have this disappointment regarding the Chinese investments, and yeah, we come to today when we have a clear, so almost the majority of the Central and Eastern European countries decided to have a pro-US approach, but in the same time, they didn't close all the doors to China. They are still maintaining relations with China. I think for the moment, I will call them that they are on autopilot. So they leave them as they are. They don't want to improve. They just let them be. Some countries from the region try to, on the same time, to improve their relations with Taiwan. We talk about the Baltics, the Czech Republic, and so on, while others, like for example, Romania, didn't do anything regarding Taiwan. And I think we should talk a little about this idea, how the region perceived the idea of strategic autonomy, because although we don't have a concrete answer from each country, from my point of view, I think the idea of strategic autonomy is perceived differently in the region from the Western countries, mainly because those securities guarantees that we are expecting for the United States. And because of them, I'm quite sure that the countries from the region don't easily decide to give, as a parenthesis, nowadays, because of the new Trump administration, strategic autonomy will imply distancing ourselves from the United States to not only from Russia and China. And because of this aspect, I think the countries from the region will not decide to let the United States leave the region and embrace an autonomy that doesn't guarantee too much for the moment. And as a matter of fact, I saw that many of our authors wrote in their articles that, for example, Czechia, Slovakia, Lithuania, Greece signed security cooperation agreements with the United States. I think it was on this idea to be sure that the United States will be there to protect themselves in case of a possible Russian invasion. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrea. And I think, I mean, in a very few minutes, you were able really to talk about certainly big topics, right? I mean, the Russia factor and how, in principle, this region that was seen as the soft belly of the EU became certainly, a much harder place for China, and perhaps Poland is the most vocal, but that goes across, with certain exceptions like Hungary, but goes across the region. Disappointment about Chinese investment, about promises that never really came about. And then the topic of strategic autonomy, right? Where, kind of, we see that there might be in principle more, and I guess there the Brussels influence is there, certain influence of in principle being in favor, but in practice still wanting the United States to be there, to continue to be the security guarantor, and highlighting this tension that is visible in this region. Xiaoshui, going from Central Eastern Europe to Central Northern Europe, how do you see things from your perspective, from your national perspective?
Thanks, Miguel. My name is Xiaoshui Martin, or Xiao. I work for Klingendael Institute, which is a Dutch think tank. So let's shift geographically to the view from there, because for the Netherlands, we've really felt the tensions between China and the US. And there's two main reasons for that. The one is that we're a very open economy, and the Netherlands, Dutch economy is very focused also on positioning itself as a gateway to Europe. With the port of Rotterdam having a lot of import-export from the US, from China, so now being hit quite hard by all the trade tensions. Now, the second reason is ASML, which I'm sure you've all heard of. They have the monopoly on chip-making equipment for the most advanced chips, which is on the one hand leverage that we have towards China, towards the US, and on the other hand, one of the reasons why the Netherlands has been targeted by both countries and has really felt those tensions from both the Netherlands, both from the US and from China. Speaking from the ASML perspective, you can imagine that the shift between the Biden and the Trump administration has been quite tough, both for the ASML company workers and for people working for the government on export restrictions, where I don't think it's a secret to say that negotiations and discussions have been a bit more easy with the Biden administration compared to the Trump administration, where the contact is a lot more haphazard and a lot less consistent. It's interesting if you look from the perspective of ASML, now they have a whole unit that's focused on geopolitics and on government relations. That didn't exist 6 years ago. It's only been in the past couple of years that ASML as a company has found itself at the mercy of, okay, we're an important company, we're being pulled from all these directions, and has felt the need to, okay, step up its game, which is something that not only ASML has to do, but actually all companies. And as Elena has said, this diversification, this de-risking is now an awareness that has come more and more, not just in the bigger companies, but also in the smaller and the medium-sized companies. Now, from the Dutch perspective, the biggest change in China policy, I would say, was in 2019, when the Dutch parliament asked the government to make a China strategy. And after a long debate between all the ministries and with think tanks, et cetera, the Dutch government came with a China note, which set a new balance with China, which really showed this shift. And to sum it up, the main conclusion is, yes, we still want to partner with China, but we also see the risks. And the Dutch strategy has really been to follow closely what the EU is doing and to try to move with the EU as much as possible. So they're also really subscribing to this idea of seeing China as a partner, competitor, and a rival. And in the Netherlands, there's quite a lot of attention, both in the policy debates, but also in public debates in the media for China. There's a yearly China debate, for example, in Parliament. where you can really see the differences between what the government policy is and what the parliament's position is. Where you have the government position where the acknowledgement has been, yes, we've seen a shift when it comes to China. It's still a partner, but the emphasis is more and more on systemic rival, especially with light of the Ukraine conflict. But the government continues to insist, okay, but we still need to engage with China, thank God. From the parliament, there's actually a lot of focus on more the risks side. So questions about Taiwan, about human rights, about economic de-risking. And there's even the request that we should remove the whole partner side in government relations with China. And I think it's good that the Dutch government has pushed back on this and has said, no, we actually still need to continue to engage with China. But to criticize the government a little bit as well, the big strategic choices still need to be made. The framework is there. Yes, we need to partner, but we see the risks. A lot has been done already to improve China knowledge. For example, we have a Dutch China knowledge network that brings together knowledge on China within the government and within society. So we do see a lot of improvement there. But we also see that a lot of the big, important, difficult choices aren't being made. And part of the reason for that is that if you follow the news, you've seen that we've had quite a few government crises in the past few months. Right now, for example, we have a caretaker government. We have a new Minister of Foreign Affairs. And because of these reasons, but also other issues, those big choices haven't been made yet. And especially in telling the public, for example, okay, if we need to de-risk, that will also cost us something. And that selling or that explaining the costs hasn't been politically popular. So that has been difficult to emphasize. Now what we see for the future, we'll have elections in October, end of October, and we'll have to see what the outcome of that will be. It will be quite a few months before we'll have a government coalition again. What I expect for China policy, at least for the next few months or for the next few periods, will actually be that China policy will be relatively consistent. So that's the interesting part about the Netherlands. Despite the government, troubles, political troubles, China policy has been relatively consistent. And I think if I can make a prediction, the Netherlands will try to continue to move with the EU on pushing China policy forward. Is also now trying to focus more on providing that critical note. For example, pushing to criticize China for cybersecurity attacks or really publicizing Chinese cybersecurity attacks, for example, on the Dutch military, when maybe in the past this wasn't expressed publicly as much before. Perhaps ASML is one of the reasons why we feel that freedom to be a bit more critical. But I think it's good if we as Europeans are a little bit more critical in that way as well. And I'll end with that.
Thanks, Sergio. And that was, I think, a nice flavor or double flavor of the ETNC network, because over the years, on a biannual basis or kind of twice a year, we would have this tour de table of every single representative of a country telling us what is the situation in their relationship with China, and I think that's the added value of this network, and I think the Netherlands is a very good example of how the relationship with China has toughened. It was one of the countries, because of its openness of having very strong trade relations with China, being much more focused on the partner aspect, and now you have the parliament wanting even to eliminate the partner leg of this relationship, but having certain leverage because of its indispensability, right? So a very, very interesting case. Finbar, how do you see things from Brussels?
Thank you. Thanks, Miguel. Thanks for having me. I'll share things from a sort of journalistic perspective as somebody who has to follow and write the news. And the report is very useful. I think in the last 5 or 6 months since publication, or at least since it was finished, we've seen the situation worsen, the need for strategic autonomy deepen, but perhaps the paradox is that the more we need it, the more elusive it seems to become. If you look at the intensification of some of the problems that Europe is facing with both of the superpowers in recent months, on the trade side with China, the numbers that are outlined in the document have gotten, well, subjectively worse depending on how you look at it. The deficit is getting wider. In August, China's trade surplus with the EU jumped by 22.5% in a single month. Last week, the Commission put out a note late on Friday evening, which is the worst time for a journalist to receive any sort of news. So thanks for that. Saying that they're very worried or they're concerned about trade diversion. Thanks to US tariffs, they're starting to see plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and steel pouring into Europe. So these situations aren't getting any better. Just this morning, I spent some time with the EU Chamber in China's position paper, which shows that they have 1,141 recommendations for the Chinese government today, compared to 1,043 recommendations that they had a year ago. So for European businesses in China, the situation seems to be getting a bit worse. And for those in Europe looking at those numbers, I suppose they would also say that that shows that things are becoming more acute. About the situation with the US, and I think the danger and the paradox of dependency is that it seems as though there's a bit of a whack-a-mole effect. So we try to cut out Russian energy and we swap that for American energy. Seems like the safer option until it's not. We don't maybe have too much choice on that, but if you look at now what Europe is trying to do with its security and defense program, we're trying to rearm. You can't do that without Chinese rare earths. So it feels like every time we turn a corner, it looks like we're confronted with a whole new set of worries and stresses about where our dependencies are. We've seen, as Maria and other speakers have outlined, China's shown great willingness to weaponize those exports over the course of this year, which I think I wanted to comment a little bit about the element in the report that Maria also mentioned about re-engagement with China. And, for that reason alone, obviously the rare earths has shown probably that it was never really going to be a thing. But that's certainly from a Brussels perspective. But if you look at what's going on in Europe this week, we have Chinese diplomats moving through Bulgaria, Austria, Slovenia, Hungary, Greece, Spain, Belarus, Serbia, obviously not EU members, but part of the bigger European region. So maybe that's something we need to look out for. I mean, we've seen over the last year how easy it is for major powers in the world to pick off European members. We've seen the cacophonous debate about using the anti-coercion instrument against the United States, which, as a reporter who went to all of the council meetings for the EV tariffs last year and the ACI this year, it looks very similar in tone. Each of the member states talking about what they need to protect in their own capital rather than what is the sort of best thing to do from the European perspective. I get a sense from speaking to folks that this sense of re-engaging, even if Europe wanted to do it, there was not much appetite from the Chinese perspective. We've seen that the summit in July yielded very little. From what I can understand, there was two deliverables. One was a very low-level climate statement, and the second was an agreement to have an alarm system about the rare earths. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense is that somebody said to me this week, there's no point having an alarm system if every time it rings, it's just ignored. It doesn't seem as though that's doing anything right now. So I think what little trust existed at the start of this year has been eroded, and it seems that, as Maria said, rather than getting better, things are getting worse. And I think there's two reasons for that, why China didn't give the Europeans anything. And it comes back to strategic autonomy and the sort of credibility deficit that I was going to say that we enjoy, that we have in Europe. I think there's been countless examples of how, Europe against both the United States and China hasn't punched back when it has the opportunity. And I know that there are a lot of calculations that go into this, but my sense is that from the Chinese perspective, maybe they see that there's not much chance of escalation. From the European perspective, they can get away without giving too many concessions. And it seems as though the Americans have also internalized that. And I think if you know, the other reason I was thinking is from Beijing's perspective. I mean, you know, we as has been said, there is not equidistance between China and America, and I feel like the Chinese know very well that, you know, if it becomes expedient in the transatlantic relationship for China to be used in a way, as we've seen Trump is trying to do right now, Europe will consider that. So I think those are two lessons that the Chinese went into this year with front of mind. And just to finish up, I think what we've seen in terms of that lack of credibility and strategic autonomy, and, you know, the Commission here being undermined by member states and so on, it reminds me of what Borrell used to say when he was the HRVP about Europe needs to choose about whether it's a playground or a player. I think events in Madrid this week really reminded me of those of that phrase, where we had the US and China meeting in you know, European capital in the Foreign Ministry of Spain, giving each other concessions that they would never dream of offering to Europe. And it was a bit of a, as someone said to me this week, having our noses rubbed in the fact that, or they said, rubbing salt in the wound. You know, the fact that we are sort of not in the game, so to speak. Not that we would ever, Europeans, be at US-China trade talks, but the fact that they keep coming here, Geneva, London, Stockholm, you know, Spain. It's quite a sort of galling thing for Europe, I think. So I'll finish there. Just some observations from my perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Wimpa. I think we have a bit of time. I think I'm gonna do another round, very quick round, and then I open it up for the discussion. Can I ask you, Elena, what do you think? And, you know, just short questions, because you know, we might open it to the rest of the room, but there are a few things that perhaps, you know, you can answer. One is, do you buy, you know, we're talking about the EU Chamber of Commerce, Jörg Wuttke's metaphor that China is some sort of fitness room for European companies. There has been a bit of a debate around that. If you can perhaps tell us a bit more. And Andrea, perhaps, could you perhaps elaborate a bit more on whether we have a plan B for US security guarantees? Do you think that the region is thinking of something sort of, okay, if the United States were not to be, and this goes, you know, I mean, recently we had the Israeli attack on Qatar, and for, you know, some countries, this was, you know, a bit shocking because the United States should be the guarantor. And so we are in a geopolitical, you know, context where perhaps we need to think of a plan B. Do you think there's a sense of let's try to find a plan B if the United States is not the security guarantor? Charles, perhaps you could very quickly as well tell us a bit more on what is the debate in the Netherlands. And this has been a lot of work done in the Netherlands and at Klingendahl on you know, research security and how that is playing out in a key field. And Finbar, lastly, I mean, there is a debate on, and you said it, right? They are meeting here in Europe. Is there a chance, because there are some people in Europe that think, okay, in this rivalry between the United States and China, we could, in a way, be a neutral player? Is that a sense that you get or ultimately, because where you sit, that it will be, you know, and Capital Economics has, you know, just released a book on fractured economy, and that they believe there will be essentially two blocks. And the big question in the book is where Europe will sit there, right? And so just quickly on those questions. Elena.
Yeah, let me start. No, I agree with that statement. For sure, we all know in this room that China thinks strategically and long term. And over the past years, if not decade, it has worked to strengthen industry, moving into higher technology products and reducing dependencies on the West and others. So making everyone dependent on China, but they are independent from others, and clearly China is no longer a producer of low value added goods. I mean, they have really now climb the ladder to produce high-end goods, and we are now in a situation where actually our companies need Chinese technology. I mean, I think that when we look into this, we need to go sector by sector. Depends on in which sector companies are. They would find themselves in a different situation, but for example, the car industry, obviously they say, well, I need to be in China because I need to capture the latest technology when it comes to batteries. So I don't really have that alternative. So what we tell to these companies is like, well, I mean, if you can benefit from certain partnerships on research and development with China, etc., why not? But just be aware that maybe this is like this today, but then in a few years they may, squeeze you out of the market if they don't need also if you're another company that is in China because the Chinese need your technology and you're welcome to the market, etc. But be aware that perhaps in a few years the situation may change rapidly. So, I mean, another point is that it's quite worrying sometimes when you speak to certain sectors that used to be, the #1 champions of free trade and open markets. For example, the European machinery industry, the wind energy sector, they used to be like, yes, let's sign as much agreements as possible because I feel very strong. I produce the most competitive goods, etc. And now these companies are actually calling for more and more TDI cases. Well, the chemical industries is another example with a big European company with investments in China, at the time very confident, etc. Now, if you look into the TDI cases, chemicals is actually the #1 in filing for anti-dumping duties. So I think that companies and sectors need to look very carefully on what are their risks and vulnerabilities. But of course, if they can be in China and benefit from a certain technology, and many companies also have said that, like, I mean, the amount of innovation happening in China is really state of the art. I really need to be there to capture that technology to then also compete in third country markets. Because let's not forget about that. The Chinese are becoming also very, very competitive in many other third country markets. So I think, like, yes, why not? I think that we all need to be aware that the Chinese are very pragmatic, thinking very long term, very self-interest, and we need to do the same. If we need certain investments in certain industries in Europe because they have a certain technology, let's welcome that investment. We as industry, we are not in the business of containing China or not investments from certain Chinese companies. Let's welcome them, but under certain conditions that they add value to the European economy and ecosystems, and they also help our companies that actually need that specific technology. So let's create, the framework for that as well.
Perfect. Andrea.
Okay, thank you, Miguel. So basically, the Plan B will be implementing the strategic autonomy that we are promoting so much. And I'm thinking about not only discussions, but really having starting to build our military power as the European Union, but also as each member state, because while for example, Romania, Poland, maybe they don't have the capacity to stand Russia for itself. We as a community, the European Union, backing each country that may be affected by a Russian invasion, I think we have the power to resist to Russia, because let's look to Ukraine. If they could, I think we could. We need money, if in case of the United States don't want to help us military, we can, I'm quite sure that Donald Trump will be more than happy to sell us military equipments for the right amount of money. So we need money, and I think we need this desire to really implement the idea of strategic autonomy and not only talk about it. And yeah, this should be the plan B, but I think in the same time, we should keep the United States here for the moment while building our military capacity to be assured that we have a backup.
Shashua.
Thanks. Yeah, on research security or knowledge security, that's really where you see the tension between openness and the one to de-risk. Dutch intelligence services have been warning that China is the biggest threat to Dutch knowledge security for years and years and years. And now we see that resonating more with universities, but also with companies. And the government is trying its best, I see, to, on the one hand, provide tools to improve knowledge security. For example, there's a contact point where universities with questions can send their questions to. For example, oh, we're thinking of collaborating with this university. What are the risks or what are the benefits? On the other hand, there's also now this development that the government is working on screening, a wetsvoorstel, a law to screen students coming in to the Netherlands. And the current way that they structure the law is they have to screen every student that comes into the Netherlands to see if they're a security risk or not. And obviously the reaction from everybody is, how are you going to do that? That is not practical. And we'll have to see what they come up with. But you can really see the tension between wanting to protect and de-risk, but then how do you do that in practice?
Firma.
You said neutral, right? That was the question.
Yeah, neutral.
No.
Yeah.
Well, I think you know the answer. But I mean, the way I see it is there's three options. If you are in a future with these tech stacks that you describe as a non-technological person, but I think the three scenarios are Europe innovates, we have our own, or Europe gets to choose the best of both or either. So maybe you have the best of Chinese batteries, the best of American chips, whatever. But I think probably the most likely scenario is that Europe is forced to take one or the other unless we sort of innovate and have our own indigenous tech stacks here. Is there a third way? I suppose, where does Europe fall in this crumbling economy? I mean, a frustration of mine has been perhaps that there hasn't been a joint effort to tackle some of the forces that Europe is facing from, say, the Trump tariffs and the, say, Chinese overcapacity. I mean, why hasn't there been like a coalition of the willing on that? Why hasn't there been? Maybe there has been behind the scenes, but we don't hear too much about that creeping into. We hear a lot about diversification, but we also hear speeches about how, in one line, Europe got the best deal, better than any of our partners, and then in the next line, well, we also need to work very closely with our partners. So, I feel like there should be a bit more of a sort of consensus-based approach from those partners who want to preserve the rule-based order, if it's there to preserve. But yeah, I mean, the question of neutrality, I suppose, is a tricky one, because I mean, to be truly neutral, I suppose you need to have your own stuff. You need to have your own security. You need to have your own technology, and I don't see that Europe has any of that right now across the board.
Okay, I mean, when I used to bring up as well these three scenarios, these three options, right? I mean, as you said, the option of going China is not there really. So the options are being kind of more into the US ecosystem. Another is to try to be in both. Another is to develop your own. And then, we're talking with business people, some of them, they would say, well, there is a fourth option, which is trying to make the American ecosystem more European, right? So we'll see. Anyway, it's a large room, so I guess just try to get my attention, and I will try to see you and then give you the word, and then you can use the mic, because I think everyone of you has a mic in front of you. John was the first to.
Well, while everybody's milling over their questions, I wanted to come back to this question of deterrence and indispensability, listening to Xiaoshui talk about maybe the one case where we have clear indispensability here in Europe in a technological sense is in lithography equipment, and that's ASML. At the same time, our indispensability in the system also makes us a point of leverage for others, because that indispensability depends on US technology. And so therefore, we're not the ones doing the deterrence. It's the United States that is weaponizing us against China. And so it's this reflection of how you build deterrence, how you maintain deterrence, because clearly we used to have technological advantages. I would argue that we used to be indispensable in many different ways in technological areas, but over time that indispensability has eroded, our technological advantage has eroded, and in many ways China's strategy over the last decade or more has been to reduce dependencies. They've had a de-risking strategy for a very long time. So how do you build? How do you maintain? And then in what conditions do you actually move to leveraging? And what would trigger that your own weaponization for your own defensive purposes of your leverage? I don't know if you want to take other questions or not, but
yes. I don't know whether Maria, Maria, do you want to kind of react to some of the things that were said in the panel, or now to John's as well comment? And a lot was said, so.
A lot was said, but I think there is a convergence of views on a number of things. And there were some very interesting points made. And I guess a majority of us get to the point, which is the most difficult one, which is how do you really get the idea of strategic autonomy into practice? And even more difficult, how do you build leverage on them? How do you decide to use it? On the strategic autonomy practice, if you want, then what we all need to understand is that is a painful exercise. It requires knowledge. It requires being very, very detailed and technology and sector specific to a degree of granularity that is not just general quantum computing, if I may give an example. And even more importantly, it requires choices. And those choices are sometimes difficult to make because you have 27 countries with 27 different economies, not only in terms of the relationship and dependencies, but also in terms of their strengths. So it is a necessary but extremely complex exercise to undertake. We need to first understand our critical dependencies. We need to prioritize. There's no way we're going to be critical dependencies free, because that will require living autarky, and we're not going to be able to do that. And here I'm not talking just about China. A clear de-risking strategy is also a difficult one. Obviously, diversification is the easiest one, but you don't solve everything via diversification. So very much what you see at the moment is, alongside attempts to diversify, are attempts to have our own industrial policy. And an industrial policy needs to be intelligent. There's a thin line between industrial policy and protectionism. And that's one that we need to be careful of. And then the building of a deterrence strategy requires understanding where do we have that indispensability. You're right, vis-a-vis China, the situation has changed extremely rapidly as a result as well of a very intelligent policy undertaken by China for the development of technology and very clear priorities. The famous Made in China 2025 already put on the table back in 2015, but also some more specific and sector-specific plans that China has developed very, very clearly in the last few years. So that part, that identification of choke points that give you the leverage that then you can deploy is where also we need to get going. And again, the transformation of the idea into a reality, into an assessment that identifies a number of sectors is a complex one. Also, I'm sorry, I'm just giving you more problems. I'm not providing you necessarily an answer. Also because of the integration of value chains. We don't produce things very often, in particular when they are complex in terms of inputs, in terms of technology. We don't produce things from zero to the end product by ourselves without supplies from third countries. In very many instances, when you start trying to identify where you might have leverage in a sector, you realize that if you were to use that leverage, it could be turned against you because some of the inputs for the leverage you are identifying come from third countries. I'm not going to get into details as to what do I have in mind. That's ongoing work, but it's a reality.
No, very interesting. Very interesting, and I think the identification of choke points, I think, might be a key aspect to look at it. Really, I mean, I don't know whether Airbus is one, but you know, something to discuss. I have a gentleman right next to me that wanted to ask a question or make a comment.
Yes, hello.
Really brief, if possible.
Yes. Eric Paul, I'm the board chair of My Data, a non-profit based in Helsinki, active on data and AI. There's a lot of discussion about data sovereignty, digital sovereignty in Brussels, from rare earth material and battery to social media and AI. How do you see this happening, and what do you think are the keys to successful implementation of digital sovereignty? We've seen the example of ASML in the Netherlands becoming a week ago the largest shareholder of Mistral AI. That's a good step, but I don't see a lot of those steps. So keys, please. Thank you.
Okay, I think that goes for everyone, you know, on the panel. Shall we collect a few and then you respond so you have a bit of time to think about this? I think I have Greg over there, the second row.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for extremely interesting input. I wanted to also talk about the topic of deterrence, which I think is key in our discussion here. And that's about the topic that Finbar also raised, the question of credibility that we've been talking about for a while now. Because I think deterrence, in the end of the day, hinges on credibility. And I think this is exactly where we have the key problem. Because right now, if we talk about this credibility, we need it now. The changes unseen in a century are unfolding right now. To my mind, it's not really necessarily a discussion about the tools that we're going to have in a couple of years, because let's be honest, despite the fact that the process of developing new tools has been extremely rapid for European standards, those standards don't necessarily apply to the geopolitical reality that we're dealing with right now. So one of the discussions that I was in recently with colleagues from DG Trade related to mentioning, for example, that 80% of new trade investigations focus on China. And indeed, this is big for us. The question of EV tariffs is also big for us. Is it necessarily big from perspective of Beijing? At the time when we have a lot of very big and bold measures that are coming also from the US. So part of the question would be for me, which tools do we have already right now that we could credibly use? And here thinking about the question of usage of new sanctions packages, the foreign subsidies regulation, the question of anti-coercion instrument that is a hot potato that nobody really wants to discuss openly. So I think we really need to have a discussion about how bold are we really going to be? And also, are we really going to go beyond WTO rules? And are we willing to be much more transactional, which is a very hard discussion to have. The second question, and that's something that was already also mentioned, the question of diversification, which I agree. And I think Maria related to this, that it doesn't really solve everything. And I think that's also points to the question of paying thresholds, because I think that Beijing arrived to the conclusion that simply it has much higher pain thresholds than the US and the EU, because we're going to cave into the markets, we're going to cave into the push from the society that is just going to vote the government out of office. So Beijing is in much more favorable position. And part of the discussion on deterrence to me would be, how do we increase pain threshold of our societies and our companies, which is a slightly different discussion than the diversification question. And I don't think that we're in this discussion yet. And finally, the last one, because I know that the time is short, it's the question of resources, which I think Xiaoxue also talked about. How do we find those resources at the time when we're talking about investing in competitiveness, investing in defense? One of the things that we've been working on at Merix is the resilience audit, where we've been looking at how member states are implementing resilience building measures. And when we're going around the capitals, the thing that we hear over and over again is, we love the recommendations, we love the ideas, we don't have the resources, because if we take more money from our social spending, you're going to have a far-right government at next elections, and this is not what we want to see. So to me, this once again comes to this pain threshold aspect. How do we also convince our societies that paying the security premium is something that we need right now? And this is where I think that really our discussion about leverage, apart from identifying them, I think we already have quite a few. Talking with colleagues from the Chinese think tanks, there was really an anxiety in the Chinese circles related to the access to the EV market in Europe, which is something that we could weaponize given the fact that those overcapacities have to be sent somewhere, but we are unwilling necessarily to use them. So are we really, really going to be able to be credible is, to my mind, the key question when we're discussing deterrence. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. I think there's quite a lot on the table, and so perhaps we can go back to the panelists and the keynote. Just, you don't have to answer all of them, but I think there are 4 questions more or less. I mean, digital sovereignty, and then a range of issues around deterrence, threshold pain, pain thresholds, and all of that, and the broader issues of, whether we have sufficient resources in terms of, the challenges that we have in front of us, etc. Finbar seemed to be keen to step in.
I don't have too much to say. I just wanted to respond to Greg's question about pain thresholds. I think like what we really need is some political honesty. I'm from Ireland, and you would never know all this stuff is going on in the world if you read the Irish papers. Our debate is very nascent about defence and security, but I do think that the average person is used to making decisions every day that, their own personal lives and so on. And I think political figures need to respect that people understand the choices that are facing the country, because they have to make painful choices themselves in their households. I think like the current state of politics and the level of discourse is not really going to cut it. If we really are going to make big changes that have been floated and suggested, it's reliant on that sort of retail level of politics at the very granular societal level to prepare to lay the groundwork for that and prepare people for it. I mean, I don't know about what it's like in other member states, but certainly I don't see that going on in Ireland. So I think that would be a great first step. Political honesty, and that I think would help then sort of translate hopefully into a bit more sort of solidarity and European unity, I hope.
On the political honesty, that's definitely the same in the Netherlands, where, I mean, in the lead up to the elections, now we have the free beer speeches left and right. But what we really need is to explain what are the costs of de-risking. For example, at our institute, my colleagues, they have a survey every year where they look at how does the Dutch public from all ages, from all political ideologies, how do they see foreign affairs? What do they see as the biggest hopes, and what do they see as the biggest fears when they look abroad? And Russia, it's now top of mind. Other things that are top of mind in the list of ranking, like what do you see as the biggest threats, are sabotage of critical infrastructure. There was also a question on what do you think or how big a threat is if we decouple from China? How big do you think the impact will be? And it was, I think, number 33 on a list of 50 questions when that's one of the biggest impacts people are going to have in their personal life. But that realization is not there, and we need, like you said, political honesty on that. And that's, I mean, something that we cannot do ourselves, but hopefully our leaders will.
Very interesting. Elena?
No, I mean, well, when it comes to Spain, and also colleagues can comment, we had a heated debate on the 5% of GDP, etc., to invest in NATO and so on. And I mean, when you say, Finbar, that the citizens and so on, they understand that we need to invest in defense and so on. I mean, the problem is that they understand the concept. They are not willing to sacrifice, spending on education, healthcare, etc., to invest in defense. This is something that, in the case of Spain, for example, I remember seeing some statistics like, do you agree with scaling up investment on defense? Yes, like 70%. Do you agree that this needs to, be cut from investments in, healthcare, etc.? 20% or so of people agree. So I don't think that at this point the society is really willing to make those sacrifices. I think that also it depends on which member states and if it's more Eastern Europe, Western Europe, that also changes the picture. And maybe quickly on the data sovereignty and so on, I remember that once there was the project of creating the European cloud and so on, and it's a difficult one. I don't know if Maria or others have a response there, but I think it's something that has been tried before, but very difficult.
Maria, I don't know whether you want to enter into the digital sovereignty question or others. Or
On digital sovereignty question, it's been discussed. This is an area where the dependencies are very clear and not necessarily from China. But again, it's one of those instances when you are confronted with reality. How do you do it in a manner that recognizes as well that you do not create certain services, that you do not create certain technologies just by mandating them as content that needs to be procured by government, for instance. So it is going to be a debate going forward in the coming months, and it's going to be an important one to get the balance right. I'm not going to talk about the paying thresholds or the public money available or not available. I just think there is one thing that hasn't been said, and it's called political leadership. That's what we need in member states at national level. You cannot wait until things get very dangerous and very bad, so people then understand that something really bad is happening and they have to change the manner in which they assess these things. But that's not going to happen to society as such. That does require a type of leadership that I hope we can produce while we still stay at a time of peace. And otherwise, as to the comment as to the hesitation to use certain of our tools, I like to nuance that. For instance, as regards the foreign subsidy regulation, it's being quite actively used across a number of member states, and both as regards procurement and investment. As regards the anti-corruption instrument, I think somehow maybe we need to step back and stop thinking there is like a bazooka or a nuclear arm that should never be used. Do remember, it doesn't require unanimity. The idea with the ACA was always they should be there to serve as a deterrent, but it is not an impossible instrument to use. So maybe at some point we also need to start qualifying it in a less exceptional manner. part of what we are trying to put together now as, remember, we're just not DigiTrade anymore, we're DigiTrade and economic security, as our work on economic security, and in particular, the development of an economic security doctrine, which we need to do and reflect in the form of a communication before the end of the year, is precisely to identify the different tools we have in our hands, and they're not only tools that belong to DigiTrade. There are a number of tools that come through the regulatory DGs, whether you're talking about DigiGrow, DigiConnect, or others, and what will be the doctrine of deployment, which I think is a very first step to translate the theory into practice.
Okay. I have another call actually from the gentleman on the second row on the other side, but if you have a question or so, I think it might be the last round, because I know we are in between this discussion or you know, and the drinks outside. So if you have questions or comments, please raise your hand so I can perhaps see you. Please, the gentleman there.
Thank you very much. I'm Etienne Sula at the German Marshall Fund. Maybe just a quick comment that's a bit off topic in response to what Elena said. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with the framing of it's either defense spending or education and healthcare spending. I think there are other places you can find money, but that's a bit beside the topic. I want to go back to the point we've been circling around on how can the EU better assert its interests, and to the point Maria raised on the interconnection of supply chains. And I fully understand that there's a concern that if we go after China in one specific sector, they will respond in a different sector. My real sincere question is, if the supply chains are interconnected, why the vulnerabilities we have to China would be very similar to the ones China has to us? Because if they go, they've been cutting germanium access, so they're going after us in one silo of the economy. Why can't we do the same in the areas we have, a chokehold on? So is it that the EU only has ASML and that's like the one secret weapon? Or is it just a lack of political will and there are in fact other, ASMLs that we're just not using?
Very, very good question. So any more comments, questions? No? Perhaps final comments from everyone here on the panel, on the Eurostack. Sorry, on the here, another voice.
Hello, my name is Iris Meyer. I'm a China desk officer in European Parliament, and I just wanted to throw out here that since we have IPM coming, and if you have some great ideas what we should raise over there, we can meet later. So I just wanted to give maybe a bit of information that there will be a big EU-China IPM coming up on the 42nd, on the 16th of October. And this is the first time after 2018. As you can imagine, I mean, meetings like that, they are very low of deliverables, but nevertheless, it happens. So we would expect probably a lot of media attention and political attention to this. So this is a bit of a, maybe a call also to look around this meeting and, well, reach out, or maybe you also want to throw here some ideas in the hat. I'm not saying that we are organizing the meeting by just asking ideas from a random group of people, even though you're not so random when it comes to China. But it would be interesting to hear what would be the think tank's expectations from this exchange. So thank you.
Okay. I just wanted to say on digital sovereignty, one of the things that happened recently, I don't know whether, and Klingendal has done some work, check it out, on the Eurostack and the Eurostack initiative, etc. And I mean, you can present a very negative picture around, where we stand in critical digital infrastructure, digital innovation, digital platforms, etc. But so there are certain things going on in the field of, the edge, perhaps not so much cloud, but the edge, which would be key, I think, in the Internet of Things, as well around, things of artificial intelligence and application of artificial intelligence at the small and medium-sized enterprise level and the industry and the industrial sector. So I would encourage you to, if you don't know it, the Eurostack initiative, which is a large initiative that is relatively new. Anyway, I said now, kind of reactions or final comments on if you have any, so that we can close this session.
Yeah, the research you mentioned, it's from my colleague Maaike Elcano. Maybe you already know her, but she worked a lot on digital sovereignty. Is working in the Netherlands as well to push the concept of digital connectivity at a time when everyone was still asking, what does this mean? So she would be the one to talk to, not me, on that topic. And as a final closing statement, to hark back on the question on the resources to keep that China knowledge, I think maybe we can give ourselves a little pat on the back as ETNC. Because for me personally, this is one of the biggest resources that I get in looking out of the Netherlands and looking into what is going on China debate in other European capitals. The quickest way to get a quick overview is talking to each other. And we should have more initiatives like this. I know colleagues of mine are talking with Merix and with, I think, the Swedish institutes to build a European China Knowledge Network, similar to, or based maybe a little bit on the Dutch China Knowledge Network, but then on a European level. And I think some of the colleagues are also here. So please do talk to them about this to build really that capacity.
Elena?
No, maybe responding to the colleague, maybe I want to rephrase what I said. What I meant is that there is a competition for resources that are very limited. And if we want to fund defense, that will have to come from elsewhere. But I fully agree that we need the political courage and leadership to indeed explain to citizens that we will have to make tough choices and that we don't have infinite resources to invest on everything.
Yeah, on that, my view has always been the same. Sometimes the debate is more on the national level, and I think we need to start talking seriously about European public goods, and European defense is a European public good, and we should not only talk about spending and how to spend, but and not so much as well about Eurobonds and how to have own resources through debt, but perhaps as well on own resources, right? If we want European public goods, we might need European taxes, European revenues, and that conversation, I think, which should have been going on for some time, it's still very, very slow in the Union, right? Euphemistically called own resources of the EU. Maria, maybe as well from you, last thoughts, and then we have the concluding remarks by Bernhard.
Last thoughts. I just probably will insist on the point you just made about China knowledge, and is indeed, that is for many of you around the room, indispensable, deep China understanding. So we do rely not only on our industry present in China, on our very, very competent delegation present in China, and our member states' China knowledge, but also the type of knowledge that institutes like the ones you represent around the table can bring to us. And in my experience, the China debate is particularly complex because it tends to be portrayed in black and white. One tends to have like big brushes of getting close or getting far from China, and it's a particularly difficult policy to get right. So just to praise your work and to assure you that I will keep now, in particular, that I got a nicely binded sample. I will keep it handy in my office.
Thanks, Maria. Really, thanks as well to making all this time for us. And I think it's a very nice way to end this panel. So over to you, Bernhard.
Thank you very much. Concluding remarks are, of course, the most unpopular part of settings like this because they stand between a very rich and long discussion and afternoon and drinks that we're going to have later. But I've been thinking for the last 2 hours here and listening to all of you what the essence of this discussion is also for our work going forward. And I want to pick up the discussion we had on choices and the discussion on China knowledge and briefly talk about something that we haven't talked about much all afternoon, and that's actually the choices that China faces and how China looks at all of this from the inside. Because China indeed is also facing pretty incredible choices, and it's part of our bread and butter to look at those, and we often don't bring them into these discussions, but it's important, I think, to understand where China is coming from. One point is that China is very much convinced and intimidating for us in thinking that they are much better at taking big choices and strategic choices. Xi Jinping has made it a big point to talk about struggle, to call on everyone to think about extreme scenarios. And that has been very effective. If you look at the data that we must imagine Xi Jinping and the Politburo or whoever is at the center, they're making the thinking and decisions. If you think about the news and data that they are looking at, it does look very bleak. They do have major issues. And although we look at China from here as a major giant, that often isn't their self-perception. This talk about struggle, I believe, is real. They do feel under substantial pressure. Just a couple of data points here. Consumption after the COVID crisis hasn't picked up again. That's a huge problem for the economy there. They have a lot and ever increasing number of loss-making companies. We look at this problem of overcapacities as something of cheap goods coming our way and distorting our markets. From their point of view, it's a major problem too, involution. It's about loss-making. They have to throw government money at that. It's about jobs. They do know there's consolidation coming in these sectors. It's a major problem for regulators. They have a massive demographic crisis. The one-child policy has gone very wrong in many ways. The society is aging. A number that a colleague of us gave us lately is that their pension system is basically running dry in 10 years, and they have no idea where the money is going to come from to fund this. They have about 250 million people who are not part of the social safety net there. And the Chinese social safety net isn't a very tightly knit, generous social net as we have here, but they're not even part in that. So they have incredible internal pressure there. And they do have choices to make of how to address that. And they do make them. They do know all these problems. It's not us finding this out and telling them any news. It's in the reform plans that they talk about. It's going to be in the next 5-year plan that is going to come out next year. It will all be in there, and they have reform initiatives, but none of them are going to be enough to actually solve any of these problems substantially. in the coming years. And they know that too, because a core choice that they also always have to make is the choice between structural reforms, big reforms, and control of the party, and keeping whatever happens within the control of the instruments that they have. And that holds them back on many fronts. And that's why a lot of the reform discussions have been so disappointing. There's always been the discussion of, will they have another Deng Xiaoping moment at some point of big, courageous reforms? We don't see them at the moment. But of course, they do have a way forward. Eventually, they know they have to pay for all of these things. And they have an idea where this money is going to come from. And that's basically from us. Because the money that they do have to spend, it's not infinite money, but it's a lot of money. They're spending it betting big on new technologies. They experimented with Made in China 2025. We all know that. It's not been completely successful. They don't have this their own passenger plane flying just yet, but it worked extremely much too well in EVs, for example, saying that as a German. So they have experience, and now they're betting on a lot of other technologies with the goal of becoming not only technologically self-reliant there, but also dominant in these technologies. And not only the technologies, but also the production and the global value chain. So they're betting big on this, and they're doubling down on this, and they want to dominate basically us, and we're starting to see the effects of that. That's why we're having a lot of the discussions that we're having now. And they also go beyond that, what we saw recently with Xi Jinping launching yet another initiative, the Global Governance Initiative. That's about rewriting the rules. That's about eventually taking over the UN system or other systems. We are a major part of their plan to solve their internal problems. And although these problems are big, and I think they're much more on their mind than we imagine, we shouldn't bet on these big problems being so big that the Chinese system is going to collapse under them anytime soon. The outward-facing problem that this produces for us is going to stay there. But that's why all these things that we see and experience, the ambitions, the dependencies that they build up intentionally, the weaponization of these dependencies, that is not a misunderstanding, as many Chinese diplomats in Europe will try to tell us. That's exactly the plan. Supporting Russia in Ukraine is not a misunderstanding. That's exactly the plan of creating big global power networks that can actually rival Western dominance. So, Maria, you've talked about rapprochement not happening. Yes, it's not happening. It's been a long time for us to accept that it's probably not going to happen, because that's part of their plan. So what does that mean for our choices here? We've talked about a lot, and I'm not going to repeat that. One thing, though, that I think is going to get very difficult for us in the next couple of years is that we'll have a very fractured picture of how different actors will look at their own benefits of what choices they have to make. Because we're currently getting, I feel, into a world where China succeeding is a scenario that is increasingly to be taken seriously. A lot of our strategies have been built on us somehow holding China back, and that was, of course, a very much a US-led ambition. And in many ways, we were hoping that this would happen. Now, things are developing at a speed where maybe not on every front, but especially from the perspective of many companies, we've talked about this fitness center metaphor. Many companies may actually take the choice that they will bet on China winning this competition. We feel that in Germany with our automotive industry, that this is a real thought that they have, and it may be very rational for companies to think about. It's also something that national governments, of course, think about. So this leads us into very dark territory. And the answer to still trying to develop policy responses and a joint strategy against that is, of course, to explain what kind of world we are going to steer into if China actually succeeds big time. And that's where it gets pretty dark. That's where it is about developing scenarios of what that would actually look like. In Europe, we've been quite good at picking up the pieces when COVID happened. The problem was huge, and if there's a perception of a huge problem, we also have the ability to actually act. Russia, Ukraine, similarly, it had to happen first before anything happened. Now, yesterday, Mario Draghi talked about his report 1 year on, saying that the warnings that he put in there about our competitiveness have not been heard, that we're in a much worse situation today than we were a year ago. So unfortunately, in some ways, I believe our work also as researchers and think tankers is to create an awareness for the world that we will lead into if these Chinese ambitions actually succeed. Now, again, there we all come from very different angles. There's no mainstream thinking here necessarily, and that is a very good thing. And Maria, you've talked about, at the end of the day, it's about leadership, it's about political leadership on these issues, and being willing to take big decisions. I guess on a think tank and researcher level, leadership is much more humble, but at the end of the day, it's about providing information and hopefully compellingly presented to make sure that peers and policymakers and business leaders do look at the realities that we see there and that do deserve some hard thinking about what to do about it. So when we call our think tanks, that's my last sentence here, I think we should understand it in the sense that we as institutes, as think tanks, provide the tank, but we all have to do the thinking together because it goes much beyond what we researchers can do. And in this spirit, thank you very much. And to the next 10 years of the European Think Tank Network on China.